Welcome, and thank you for joining us as we embark on an important journey through one of the most significant and difficult chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade and the forced migration of Africans to the Americas. This is not just a story of the past, but a history that still shapes our world today, touching millions of lives across continents and generations. Through this program, we honor the strength, resilience, and enduring spirit of the men, women, and children who endured unimaginable suffering. Their stories of loss, courage, resistance, and hope must never be forgotten. We will explore the rise and fall of the slave trade, the brutal realities of the Middle Passage, the creation of new cultures in the Americas, and the ongoing struggle for justice and dignity. We invite you to listen, to learn, and to reflect. As we confront this painful history, we also recognize the triumphs of the human spirit, acts of survival, community, and creativity in the face of oppression. May this story deepen your understanding and inspire your compassion, reminding us all that the past lives on in the present, and that remembrance is the first step toward healing and justice. Before the arrival of European traders, Africa was a continent of vast kingdoms, bustling cities, and vibrant cultures. From the powerful empires of Mali and Songhai in West Africa to the thriving city-states along the Swahili coast, African societies were centers of trade, art, science, and innovation. Wealth was measured in gold, salt, and agricultural abundance. Families were large and communities closely knit, guided by deep-rooted traditions, beliefs, and a respect for ancestry. In places like Timbuktu, scholars gathered in grand libraries, while in the forests of the Congo, skilled artisans crafted beautiful sculptures and masks. African kings ruled over complex societies, often engaged in commerce with neighboring kingdoms and distant traders from North Africa, Middle East, and beyond. Music, storytelling, and dance played a central role in daily life, connecting generations and preserving history. It's essential to remember this rich, complex tapestry when discussing the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were not passive victims. They were people with histories, families, and achievements. Their worlds were shattered by the slave trade, but their resilience and spirit endured. This chapter sets the stage, reminding us of what was lost and what still survives in African culture today. The Shuwath century marked a turning point in world history as European powers, driven by curiosity, ambition, and the quest for new wealth, began to explore the African coast. The Portuguese, followed by the Spanish, Dutch, French, and British, set sail in search of gold, spices, and a sea route to Asia. Navigators like Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored expeditions that mapped the African shoreline, making contact with local rulers and traders. At first, these encounters were based on trade. European goods such as textiles, weapons, and alcohol were exchanged for gold, ivory, and pepper. Yet, as the demand for labor in the New World plantations grew, these early relationships set the stage for something far darker. The growing power imbalance and the lure of profit soon shifted the focus from goods to people. European ships, equipped with new navigation technologies and driven by the promise of riches, became a common sight along the African coast. The era of exploration would soon become an era of exploitation, forever altering the fate of millions of Africans. The seeds of the transatlantic slave trade were sown, and the consequences would reverberate for centuries. The first meetings between Africans and Europeans were marked by curiosity and cautious optimism. African leaders saw opportunities for new alliances and trade, while Europeans marveled at the riches and organization of the societies they encountered. Initial exchanges were diplomatic, gifts were traded, and agreements were made. These early interactions took place in the courts of African kings, on the decks of European ships, and in the lively markets of coastal towns. But beneath the surface, misunderstandings and mistrust began to grow. European demands increased, and their technologies, particularly firearms, disrupted the balance of power among African states. Some African rulers sought to use European alliances to gain an edge over rivals, while others resisted encroachment on their sovereignty. Despite these tensions, these first encounters were often peaceful. Yet, as European ambitions grew and the demand for slaves soared in the Americas, these relationships would deteriorate, giving way to violence, betrayal, and tragedy. The hopeful beginnings would soon give way to the horrors of the slave trade. The birth of the transatlantic slave trade was a slow and complex process, driven by European expansion and the colonization of the Americas. In the Sherlock century, as European settlers established colonies in the Caribbean and South America, the demand for cheap, forced labor skyrocketed. Native populations, devastated by disease and conflict, could not meet the labor needs of the expanding sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. European powers, especially Portugal and Spain, turned to West Africa as a source of labor. What began as a trickle soon became a torrent. European merchants set up fortified trading posts along the West African coast, entering agreements with local rulers to purchase enslaved people. The slave trade became an immense, organized business with ships, warehouses, and vast networks of traders. Over the next 3 centuries, millions of Africans would be uprooted and sold across the Atlantic. The trade created immense profits for European traders and African elites who participated, but for the vast majority of Africans, it meant terror and loss. This chapter marks the beginning of one of history's darkest enterprises, a commerce in human lives that would shape the destiny of continents. Many African kingdoms played complex roles in the transatlantic slave trade. Some rulers, seeking to expand their power or protect their people from enslavement, forged alliances with European traders. They supplied captives from rival tribes or internal wars in exchange for weapons, cloth, or luxury items. These alliances were often fraught, with African leaders negotiating hard for the best terms while trying to preserve their own authority. The involvement of African kingdoms reminds us that the slave trade was not a simple story of black and white, oppressor and oppressed. It was a tragedy enabled by greed, rivalry, and survival, and one that left scars on Africa that persist to this day. European trading posts, known as slave castles or forts, became the linchpins of the transatlantic slave trade. Built along the West African coast by the Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French, these fortified structures served as depots where enslaved Africans were held before being shipped to the Americas. Life in the slave castles was horrific. Captives were packed into dark, crowded dungeons for days or weeks, suffering from hunger, disease, and terror. Overhead, European officials lived in relative comfort, conducting business and awaiting ships from across the sea. The castles were sites of violence and despair, but also of resistance, as many captives tried to escape or revolt. These forts still stand today as silent witnesses to the suffering and endurance of those who passed through their gates. They remind us of the human cost of the slave trade and of the systems and institutions that enabled it. Most Africans who ended up in the transatlantic slave trade were captured far from the coast. Slave raiders, sometimes rival African groups, sometimes organized bands working with European traders, would attack villages in the dead of night, burning homes and seizing men, women, and children. Others were captured in wars or sold as punishment for crimes. The captives were bound together with ropes or shackles, often forced to walk for hundreds of miles to the coast in long lines called coffles. The journey was brutal. Many died from exhaustion, hunger, or violence along the way. Families were torn apart, and those who survived carried physical and emotional scars that would last a lifetime. These acts of violence and betrayal disrupted centuries-old communities and cultures, setting the stage for generations of suffering. The march from the interior of Africa to the coastal slave forts was an ordeal of unimaginable cruelty. Captives, chained together by the neck or ankles, formed long lines called coffles. Guards forced them forward with whips and guns. The journey could last weeks or months, passing through dense forests, deserts, and unfamiliar terrain. Food and water were scarce, and disease spread quickly among the exhausted captives. Those who could not keep up were left to die or killed. Despite the brutality, many captives tried to escape. A few succeeded, but most were hunted down. The march was designed to break their spirits and weed out the weak before they reached the coast. For the survivors, the coast did not bring freedom, but only a new chapter of horror. The holding pens of the slave castles and the looming terror of the Middle Passage. Upon arrival at the coast, captives were crammed into the dank, airless dungeons of slave castles, waiting for the ships that would take them across the ocean. In these underground cells, hundreds of men, women, and children lived in utter darkness and filth, deprived of adequate food, water, or sanitation. The stench was overpowering, and disease was rampant. European officers and soldiers carried out regular inspections, separating captives by age, sex, and perceived strength. Some were branded with hot irons to identify their owners. Punishments for resistance were brutal. Captives who tried to escape or revolt were chained in isolation or left to die. Yet even here, captives showed remarkable resilience. They supported each other, shared stories, and held on to hope. Their strength in the face of unimaginable suffering is a testament to the human spirit. The sale of enslaved Africans was a complex process involving negotiations between European traders and African elites. Bartering took place in castle courtyards or open-air markets, with Europeans offering textiles, guns, liquor, and metal goods in exchange for human lives. African intermediaries often drove hard bargains, seeking the best prices for captives. Some African traders tried to protect their own people by selling prisoners of war or criminals. Others saw the trade as a means to gain wealth and Europeans' goods. For the Europeans, the goal was to maximize profit. They preferred young, healthy captives and were ruthless in their assessments. Each negotiation determined the fate of real people. With a handshake or the exchange of goods, a captive's life was forever altered, setting in motion a journey of trauma and survival. Before boarding the ships, enslaved Africans were subjected to invasive inspections and branding. European traders examined every captive for signs of disease or injury, assessing their fitness for the grueling journey ahead. Those who passed were branded with hot irons bearing the symbols of their new owners, a permanent mark of their loss of freedom. The process was both physically and emotionally excruciating. Children cried out in pain. Adults endured in silence or screamed in agony. Some captives were separated from loved ones at this stage, sent to different ships or buyers. Branding was intended to dehumanize, to turn people into property. Yet even in these moments, many captives resisted or tried to comfort each other. The branding left scars that would last a lifetime. a cruel reminder of the violence and inhumanity of the slave trade. Boarding the slave ships marked the beginning of the dreaded Middle Passage. Shackled two by two, captives were herded onto crowded decks and forced down into the hold. The ships were designed to maximize profit, not comfort. Men, women, and children were packed in tightly, with barely enough room to move. The stench of fear, sweat, and human waste was overwhelming. Many captives had never seen the ocean before. Some believed they were being taken to be eaten by cannibals. The trauma of separation from home and family was compounded by the terror of the unknown. European crews worked with brutal efficiency, herding their human cargo like livestock. Once the hatches closed, the Middle Passage began, a nightmare journey that would test the limits of human endurance. The Middle Passage was the harrowing ocean voyage that transported enslaved Africans to the Americas. Conditions on board were abysmal. Hundreds of people were chained in the ship's hold, unable to stand or move freely. Ventilation was poor, and the heat was suffocating. Diseases like dysentery and smallpox spread quickly, killing many before they ever saw land again. Worse, the crossing could take weeks or months, depending on weather and currents. Crew members fed the captives barely enough to survive, and those who died were thrown overboard without ceremony. Many captives tried to resist, refusing food or attempting suicide. Others clung to hope and sang songs of home. For those who survived, the ordeal was just beginning. The Middle Passage is remembered as one of the most horrific chapters in human history. A journey defined by cruelty, death, and resilience. Life below deck was a waking nightmare. Chained together in stifling darkness, captives endured constant hunger, thirst, and the agony of wounds and disease. The ship rocked violently in storms, sending captives sliding into each other and aggravating injuries. Bodily waste, vomit, and rotting food turned the hold into a foul, disease-ridden environment. Crew members rarely descended, except to force-feed the unwilling or remove the dead. In these unbearable conditions, captives found solace in whispered prayers, songs, or simply holding hands with a stranger. Despite the horror, a sense of solidarity often grew. Elders offered comfort, the strong protected the weak. Life below deck tested the limits of survival, but it also showed the enduring power of the human spirit. Disease and death were constant companions on the slave ships. Dysentery, smallpox, and fever spread rapidly in the filthy, crowded conditions. Weak or sick captives were often left untreated, their bodies piling up in the corners of the hold. The mortality rate was staggering. On some voyages, as many as 1/3 of the captives died before reaching the Americas. Their bodies were tossed overboard, sometimes without a word, to make room for the living. Crew members also fell ill, but their suffering was rarely as great as that of the captives. This chapter of the journey is a grim reminder of the utter disregard for African lives that defined the slave trade, and of the endurance of those who managed to survive, even in the depths of despair. Enslaved Africans did not always submit to their fate. On slave ships crossing the Atlantic, acts of rebellion and resistance were common, though they often ended in tragedy. Despite the overwhelming odds, chains, cramped quarters, armed guards, many captives risked everything to regain their freedom or to die trying. Sometimes, rebellion began with whispered plans in the darkness of the hold. Men and women plotted to overpower the crew, break their chains, and take control of the ship. On rare occasions, these revolts succeeded. Ships were seized, and survivors returned to Africa or found refuge in distant lands. More often, however, the crew responded with brutal force. Rebels were executed, starved, or thrown overboard as warnings to others. Other forms of resistance were quieter, but no less powerful. Some captives refused to eat, hoping to die rather than endure enslavement. Others sang songs of home, practiced forbidden rituals, or passed along secret messages. These acts were defiant claims to dignity and identity, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. Rebellion and resistance on the slave ships remind us that the enslaved were not passive victims. They were people fighting for their lives, their families, and their humanity at every step of the journey, even in the depths of despair. Enslaved Africans did not always submit to their fate. On slave ships crossing the Atlantic, acts of rebellion and resistance were common, though they often ended in tragedy. Despite the overwhelming odds, chains, cramped quarters, armed guards, many captives risked everything to regain their freedom or to die trying. Sometimes, rebellion began with whispered plans in the darkness of the hold. Men and women plotted to overpower the crew, break their chains, and take control of the ship. On rare occasions, these revolts succeeded, ships were seized, and survivors returned to Africa or found refuge in distant lands. More often, however, the crew responded with brutal force. Rebels were executed, starved, or thrown overboard as warnings to others. Other forms of resistance were quieter, but no less powerful. Some captives refused to eat, hoping to die rather than endure enslavement. Others sang songs of home, practiced forbidden rituals, or passed along secret messages. These acts were defiant claims to dignity and identity, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. Rebellion and resistance on the slave ships remind us that the enslaved were not passive victims. They were people fighting for their lives, their families, and their humanity at every step of the journey. After weeks or months at sea, the slave ships finally reached the shores of the Americas. For the survivors, arrival brought a mix of fear, relief, and uncertainty. Weakened and traumatized, the captives were brought ashore, often unable to walk without help, blinking in the harsh new sunlight. In the Caribbean, Brazil, or the North American colonies, the enslaved were first sent to quarantine or seasoning camps, where many died from a familiar disease. Survivors were then herded to bustling ports and auction yards, where they faced the agony of public display and sale. The arrival marked a moment of profound loss. Torn from their homelands, families, and cultures, the Africans entered a world that would see them as property. Yet, for many, it was also a moment of resolve, an opportunity, however faint, to survive and adapt. Some clung to memories of home, others began to build new communities with fellow captives, creating the roots of African diasporic culture in the New World. The landing of enslaved Africans transformed the Americas forever, laying the foundation for economies built on their forced labor and planting seeds of resistance that would grow for centuries. The auction block was the site of some of the most traumatic moments in the lives of enslaved Africans. Upon arrival, captives were cleaned, oiled, and forced to stand on display in public squares or auction houses. Buyers inspected their teeth, muscles, and bodies as if they were livestock, showing no regard for their humanity. Families who had survived the Middle Passage together were often separated, sold to different plantations or owners. Children were ripped from their mothers, spouses from each other. The cries of the separated echoed through the market, but the business of slavery was relentless and unfeeling. Bidding was competitive, with prices set according to age, health, and perceived strength. The strongest men and women fetched the highest prices, while the old, sick, or very young were often sold in groups at discounted rates. The auctioneer's gavel determined the fate of each person. For the enslaved, the auction block was a moment of total powerlessness. Yet many resisted in subtle ways, refusing to show fear, hiding skills that might separate them from loved ones, or memorizing the faces of those taken from them. The cruelty of the auction was matched only by the resilience of those forced to endure it. One of the deepest wounds inflicted by the transatlantic slave trade was the separation of families. From the moment of capture to the auction block, families were torn apart repeatedly, with parents, children, siblings, and spouses sold to different owners, sometimes never to see one another again. The trauma of separation was both immediate and enduring. Mothers clung to their children, begging for mercy. Husbands and wives tried desperately to stay together, often making bargains or pleading with buyers. But in the brutal logic of the slave market, human bonds were secondary to profit. Family ties were severed at the stroke of a pen or the fall of an auctioneer's gavel. These losses were not just personal but cultural. The destruction of family units fractured the transmission of language, tradition, and history. Yet, amid this devastation, enslaved people created new families and kinship networks in the Americas. Adopting orphans, forging bonds with fellow captives, and rebuilding a sense of belonging. The resilience of these new families, forged in suffering, became a crucial source of strength and hope. Through song, story, and shared labor, enslaved Africans passed on their heritage to future generations, keeping alive the memory of those lost and the possibility of reunion. For those who survived the auction block, life on the plantations was a harsh new reality. Enslaved Africans were put to work on sprawling estates, growing sugar, cotton, tobacco, rice, and other lucrative crops. The work was backbreaking and unending, dawn to dusk under the watchful eyes of overseers, with only brief breaks for meager meals. Plantations were isolated and tightly controlled. Most enslaved people lived in simple cabins, sleeping on bare floors and surviving on rations barely sufficient for survival. Punishments for disobedience or resistance were severe: whippings, shackling, or worse. Women faced the added threat of sexual violence from owners and overseers. Despite these brutal conditions, the enslaved found ways to endure and resist. They built secret communities, practiced traditional songs, dances, and rituals, and found strength in faith and solidarity. Elderly Africans passed down stories and wisdom, preserving a sense of identity amid oppression. The plantation system was designed to dehumanize and exploit. Yet, the resilience, creativity, and courage of the enslaved people transformed these spaces into sites of survival and, eventually, resistance. Their enduring legacy is a testament to the human will to live and the power of community. The daily work of enslaved Africans on plantations was relentless and grueling. From sunrise to sunset, men, women, and even children toiled in the fields or workshops. In the Caribbean and American South, sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rice demanded intense, coordinated labor. Overseers, often armed and ruthless, drove the enslaved with shouts and whips, punishing anyone who slowed or faltered. The work was not only physically exhausting, but also psychologically crushing. Enslaved people had little control over their own lives or bodies. Days began before dawn with the sound of a bell or horn, signaling the start of another punishing round of labor. Some cut sugarcane beneath the sweltering sun. Others tended cotton fields, rice paddies, or tobacco plants. Skilled workers, such as carpenters or blacksmiths, were sometimes allowed slightly better conditions, but were never truly free. Night brought little relief. Exhausted bodies collapsed in cramped, rough cabins, and the threat of nighttime punishment or sexual violence was always present. Disease, malnutrition, and injury were rampant. Enslaved mothers and fathers struggled to protect their children and pass on hope in the harshest of circumstances. Yet, amid the suffering, the enslaved drew strength from each other. Shared songs, stories, and spiritual practices became acts of defiance and survival. These moments of humanity, brief as they were, formed the roots of resilience and resistance that would shape future generations. Despite the constant brutality and control of plantation life, enslaved Africans never lost their will to resist and survive. Resistance took many forms, some dramatic and open, others subtle and quiet. For many, survival itself was an act of rebellion against a system designed to destroy their humanity. Some enslaved people fought. They broke tools, set fire to crops, sabotaged equipment, or faked illness to slow down production. Acts of defiance, no matter how small, were dangerous and could bring harsh punishment, yet they were daily reminders that the enslaved had not surrendered their spirit. Many learned to communicate in secret, passing along warnings or sharing plans for escape. Others found ways to survive through cultural resistance. They sang songs in their native languages, told stories from Africa, practiced hidden rituals, and built networks of support with fellow captives. Religious gatherings, whether in secret or under the eyes of overseers, became spaces of hope and solidarity. These cultural traditions not only kept memories of home alive, but also laid the foundation for new communities and identities. Some brave souls risked everything to escape. Using the cover of night or the chaos of storms, they slipped into the forests and swamps, seeking freedom in maroon communities or with sympathetic allies. Others led open revolts, inspiring fear in slaveholders and hope among the oppressed. Through resistance and survival, enslaved Africans claimed their dignity and humanity, shaping a legacy of strength that would endure for generations. Amid the harsh realities of enslavement, African culture and spirituality became lifelines for those in captivity. Despite attempts by slaveholders to suppress African languages, religions, and traditions, the enslaved found ways to preserve and transform their heritage, often blending it with elements from the Americas and Europe. Music, dance, and storytelling remained vital forms of expression and resistance. Songs sung in the fields or around cabin fires not only helped keep pace during grueling labor, but also preserved African rhythms and languages. Drumming and dancing, though sometimes forbidden, persisted in secret gatherings, allowing the enslaved to celebrate, mourn, and maintain a sense of identity. Spirituality was another crucial source of strength. Many enslaved Africans adapted their ancestral beliefs to new realities, blending them with Christianity or indigenous American traditions. Rituals, prayers, and spiritual songs offered hope, comfort, and a sense of connection to both ancestors and future generations. Secret meetings, sometimes called hush harbors, became places of worship, healing, and solidarity. Through these cultural practices, enslaved people created new traditions that would form the foundation of African American, Afro-Caribbean, and Afro-Latin cultures. Folktales and proverbs taught lessons of resilience and cleverness. Names, recipes, and crafts preserved memories of home. Culture and spirituality in captivity were acts of resistance. A declaration that, even in bondage, the spirit could not be broken. The legacy of these traditions endures, a testament to the creativity, faith, and resilience of those who survived. Women and children were central to the story of slavery in the Americas. They endured unique hardships, played crucial roles in the survival of their communities, and often bore the heaviest burdens of exploitation and violence. Enslaved women worked alongside men in the fields, performed endless domestic labor, and cared for children, both their own and those of others. despite the constant threat of separation. Women were vulnerable to sexual abuse from slaveholders and overseers. Many were forced to bear children who would also be enslaved, enduring the pain of giving birth under harsh conditions, and the fear of seeing their children taken away. Yet, women also became the bedrock of family life, passing down traditions, stories, and skills from Africa and forging new networks of support and care. Children faced a world stripped of innocence. Many began labor at a young age, carrying water, tending livestock, or picking crops. Play and education were luxuries rarely afforded, but children found moments of joy and learning in stolen hours, often guided by elders who taught them songs, language, and values that connected them to their roots. The resilience of women and children helped sustain enslaved communities through the worst hardships. Mothers, grandmothers, and aunties were often healers, spiritual leaders, and defenders of tradition. Children's laughter and learning became beacons of hope for the future. Despite the system's cruelty, these bonds of care and teaching kept alive the promise of freedom and the preservation of identity. The Caribbean was one of the main destinations for enslaved Africans during the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, became epicenters of brutal plantation economies fueled by sugar, coffee, and rum. The climate and demand for crops led to some of the harshest conditions for enslaved people anywhere in the Americas. Work on Caribbean plantations was punishing and dangerous. The intense heat, grueling pace, and frequent beatings resulted in shockingly high death rates. In some places, enslaved populations had to be constantly replenished by new arrivals from Africa because so many died within a few years. Enslaved people lived in cramped huts, surviving on meager rations and enduring cruel punishments for even the smallest perceived infractions. Yet, amidst the suffering, African culture took root and flourished in the Caribbean. Enslaved people maintained traditions, created new forms of music, religion, and foodways, and built strong communities. The Caribbean also became a site of fierce resistance. Runaway slaves, known as Maroons, established free communities in the mountains and forests, and rebellions periodically erupted across the islands. The legacy of Caribbean slavery is complex. Its wealth helped build European empires, but its suffering gave rise to enduring cultures and histories of resistance. Today, the music, language, and traditions of the Caribbean bear witness to the survival and creativity of those forced to its shores. South America, especially Brazil, received more enslaved Africans than any other part of the Americas. Portuguese Brazil became a vast center of sugar, coffee, and later gold mining, all built on the backs of millions of enslaved men, women, and children. The scale of slavery in Brazil was staggering. By the time the trade ended, nearly 5 million Africans had been brought across the Atlantic. Life on Brazilian plantations and in mines was extraordinarily harsh. Enslaved people labored long hours in the sugar fields, faced brutal punishments, and suffered high mortality rates from disease and overwork. In the mining regions of Minas Gerais, men, women, and even children were forced into dangerous, back-breaking labor underground, extracting gold and precious stones for European markets. Yet, despite repression, African traditions flourished. Brazil's enslaved communities kept alive languages, religions such as candomblé, and musical forms that would become world famous, like samba. Enslaved people formed brotherhoods and mutual aid societies, and some managed to purchase their freedom. Brazil also saw the rise of powerful quilombos, communities of runaway slaves who resisted for decades. The most famous, Quilombo dos Palmares, survived for nearly a century and became a symbol of freedom and defiance. The legacy of slavery in South America is woven into the continent's history, culture, and people. Its impact is still visible in Brazil's music, religion, and struggles for racial justice. In North America, slavery took on its own distinct forms, most notably in the British colonies that would become the United States. Enslaved Africans and their descendants played a crucial role in building the economy, especially in the southern colonies where tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton dominated. By the Chubut and Chillicothe centuries, millions of people were enslaved from the Chesapeake Bay to the Deep South. Life for enslaved people varied depending on the region and crop, but hardship, violence, and family separation were universal. In the Cotton South, enslaved laborers worked from dawn until dusk under the supervision of harsh overseers. Small groups lived on isolated plantations, sometimes in relative isolation from whites, which allowed for a vibrant retention of African traditions, speech, and religion. In urban areas, some enslaved people worked as artisans, domestic servants, or skilled laborers. Laws known as slave codes strictly controlled nearly every aspect of enslaved people's lives, denying them legal rights and punishing any hint of rebellion or escape. Families could be split at any time by sale, and the constant threat of violence hung over daily life. Despite these circumstances, enslaved communities developed rich cultural traditions, spirituals, folktales, crafts, and kinship networks. Many resisted in subtle ways, learning to read in secret, preserving forbidden customs, and supporting each other through adversity. Over time, the contradictions of slavery would contribute to growing tension and the eventual fight for freedom and civil rights. The legacy of slavery in North America continues to shape society, culture, and conversations about justice and equality. Amid the brutality of slavery, some enslaved Africans escaped and established independent communities known as maroon societies. These groups formed in remote mountains, swamps, and forests across the Americas, from the Blue Mountains of Jamaica and the jungles of Suriname to the swamps of the American South. The Maroons were living proof that the human spirit could endure, resist, and even thrive despite relentless oppression. Escape was always dangerous. Runaways risked violent retribution, the threat of capture by patrols or bounty hunters, and the challenges of survival in unfamiliar wilderness. Yet, many were willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Maroon communities grew as more people fled plantations, sometimes taking their families and even helping others to escape. Maroon societies became centers of resistance, hope, and survival. They inspired other enslaved people to dream of escape and offered safe havens for fugitives. Their stories remind us that the fight for freedom never ceased. Even in the darkest times throughout the Americas, enslaved Africans and their descendants rose up in rebellion against their oppressors. Slave revolts were acts of extraordinary courage and desperation, driven by the unbearable conditions of bondage and the unbreakable longing for freedom. From the earliest days of the slave trade, resistance took many forms, sometimes small and spontaneous, waver and spontaneous, other times carefully planned. Some of the most famous uprisings shook the very foundations of the slave system. In Ichibite-Censurjult, the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina saw dozens of enslaved men march toward freedom, fighting their way towards Spanish Florida. In Jamaica, massive slave revolts like Tacky's War challenged the might of the British Empire. And across the Caribbean and South America, enslaved people repeatedly fought back, burning plantations, killing overseers, and demanding justice. Not all revolts succeeded. Most were brutally suppressed, and leaders were often executed as warnings to others. But the revolts left a lasting mark. They forced slaveholders to reckon with the constant threat of rebellion and inspired future generations. Even failed revolts sent a clear message that the enslaved would never accept their fate without a fight. The courage of those who led and participated in these uprisings is still honored today. Their stories remind us that resistance is a fundamental part of the history of slavery. A story not just of suffering, but of defiance, hope, and the never-ending struggle for liberty as the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade became more widely known. A movement to abolish slavery began to take shape in Europe. In the late Shubath and early Shujoth centuries, ordinary citizens, religious leaders, and former enslaved people joined together to challenge the powerful economic interests that profited from slavery. This movement, known as abolitionism, grew into a powerful force for change. In Britain, activists like Thomas Clarkson, Oloda Equiano, and William Wilberforce gathered evidence, organized petitions, and spoke out against the cruelty of the slave trade. Their efforts brought the voices of the enslaved into the public sphere. We're exposing the realities of the Middle Passage and plantation life to those who had never witnessed them. The abolitionists used books, pamphlets, public lectures, and graphic images to awaken the conscience of the nation. Women played a vital role as well, organizing boycotts of slave-produced sugar and textiles, and creating anti-slavery societies. The Quakers, a religious group committed to social justice, were among the earliest and most consistent opponents of slavery. Abolitionists faced fierce opposition from merchants, politicians, and plantation owners, but their movement steadily gained strength. The struggle was long and often bitter, but by 1885, Britain banned the slave trade, and other European nations soon followed. The abolition movement did not end slavery overnight, but it marked a crucial turning point. It demonstrated that the power of ordinary people, guided by conscience and determined activism, could challenge and eventually change even the most entrenched systems of injustice. The Haitian Revolution stands as the most successful slave uprising in world history, and the only one that led to the founding of a free black republic. Beginning in Ichenchi-by-Joseri, enslaved Africans on the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Now Haiti rose up against their masters, launching a struggle that would forever change the Atlantic world. Inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, tens of thousands of enslaved men and women rebelled, setting plantations ablaze and fighting for their freedom. Leaders such as Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Henri Christophe emerged, uniting former slaves, free people of color, and even some sympathetic whites in a battle against French, Spanish, and British forces. The fighting was brutal and long, marked by shifting alliances, betrayals, and immense suffering. Yet, despite overwhelming odds, the revolutionaries prevailed. In Itsen-Babaitlingsi, after more than a decade of warfare, the Haitians declared independence, abolishing slavery and founding the first Black Republic in the Americas. In Ichenchi-Babaitlingchi, after years of relentless campaigning by abolitionists, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal to buy, sell, or transport enslaved Africans across the British Empire. This historic decision was the result of one of the first mass social movements in history, driven by the voices of former slaves, religious groups, and ordinary citizens who demanded an end to the inhuman trade. The new law marked a turning point. British naval patrols began policing the Atlantic, intercepting slave ships, freeing their human cargo and capturing slave traders. Though the law didn't end slavery itself, enslaved people remained in bondage. For decades more, it struck a powerful blow against the transatlantic system. Other countries, pressured by Britain and their own abolitionist movements, soon followed. Denmark, the United States, and eventually France and Spain passed similar laws. Enforcing the ban was not easy. Many traders continued illegally, shifting routes and using false flags. The British Navy's West Africa Squadron became a symbol of this new commitment. 4. Seizing hundreds of ships and rescuing tens of thousands of Africans. Life for these liberated Africans was uncertain. Some settled in Sierra Leone, while others faced new challenges. The Chen-Barbite-Lingchi Act was a crucial victory, but it was only the beginning. Abolitionists would now focus their efforts on ending slavery itself, a battle that would rage on for decades. Yet, this moment marked the beginning of the end for the Atlantic slave trade and demonstrated the power of organized, moral action to change the world. Through the Underground Railroad was a secret network of routes, safe houses, and courageous people dedicated to helping enslaved Africans escape from bondage. In the United States, to freedom in the North and Canada. Though not an actual railroad, this system relied on the bravery and ingenuity of conductors who guided fugitives through forests, across rivers, and over dangerous terrain, often at great personal risk. Runaway slaves traveled by night, hiding by day in barns, cellars, or hidden compartments. Every step was fraught with danger. Slave catchers, informants, and harsh laws like the Fugitive Slave Act threatened both escapees and their helpers. Yet, despite these dangers, thousands made the perilous journey to freedom. Their determination was matched by the compassion of free black and white allies, many motivated by faith or personal conviction. Famous figures like Harriet Tubman, herself a runaway slave, became legends for leading dozens, even hundreds, to safety. Code words and secret signals were used to protect routes and keep information out of the hands of pursuers. The Underground Railroad became a symbol of hope and resistance, inspiring both those who fled and those who stayed behind. Though it could not free all enslaved people, the Underground Railroad weakened the system of slavery, spread stories of courage, and laid the groundwork for later civil rights struggles. It remains a powerful testament to the solidarity and humanity that persisted in the darkest times. In Ulysses, for enslaved people, the war brought new hope and peril. As Union armies moved south, thousands of enslaved men, women, and children escaped plantations to seek refuge behind Union lines, risking their lives for the chance at freedom. Many black men joined the Union Army, forming regiments like the famous Wootersith, Massachusetts, fighting bravely for their own liberation and the defeat of slavery. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in Chen-Barbite-Lingchi declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held territories, transforming the war into a struggle for human rights. The proclamation didn't end slavery everywhere, but it gave moral and legal force to the abolitionist cause. By war's end, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. Emancipation brought both jubilation and uncertainty. Freed people reunited with lost families, founded schools and churches, and began building new lives, despite facing fierce opposition and systemic racism. The war and emancipation were monumental steps toward justice, but the long struggle for true equality and dignity would continue for generations. By the late 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade had finally been brought to an end, the result of decades of struggle by abolitionists changing economic interests, and growing international pressure, Britain's naval patrols, abolitionist campaigns, and treaties with African and American leaders steadily made it harder for slavers to operate. Gradually, other European powers, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, followed suit, passing laws to outlaw the slave trade and eventually slavery itself in their colonies. Yet, the end of the trade did not come quickly or easily. Illegal slaving continued for years, driven by high demand and vast profits, especially in Brazil and Cuba. Enslaved people in these regions waited anxiously for their freedom. As enforcement lagged, some ship captains, when caught, would throw captives overboard to destroy the evidence of their crimes. Despite these horrors, the abolition movement persisted. Freed Africans in places like Sierra Leone and Liberia began to build new communities, while the descendants of the enslaved in the Americas worked to reunite families and establish new lives. In Bashabad, Brazil became the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, finally closing one of history's darkest chapters. The end of the Atlantic slave trade did not erase the scars it left behind. Families remained separated, communities were transformed, and entire societies had to grapple with the legacy of centuries of injustice. But the triumph over the slave trade was a victory for humanity, a testament to the power of collective action, hope, and the enduring desire for freedom. Thank you for joining us on this profound journey through the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the enduring strength of the African diaspora. By remembering this difficult past, we honor the countless lives that were uprooted, the families forever changed, and the communities that, against all odds, forged beauty, resistance, and hope from unimaginable pain. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is not just a chapter of suffering. It is a story of resilience, creativity, and humanity's relentless pursuit of justice and freedom. The legacy of those who endured continues to shape our cultures, our music, our ideas, and our very sense of right and wrong. It reminds us of the dangers of forgetting, the necessity of confronting uncomfortable truths, and the power of collective action to create change. As you leave this story, may you carry with you not only the weight of what was lost, but also the inspiration of what survived, the spirit of a people who refused to be broken, and the ongoing call to build a more just and compassionate world for all. Remember, history lives within us, and together we can ensure it guides us toward a brighter future. The memory and legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continue to shape societies across the world. For the descendants of enslaved Africans, remembering this history is both a duty and a challenge. Monuments, museums, oral traditions, and annual commemorations serve as reminders of those who suffered and those who survived. Families pass down stories, preserving the names, songs, and customs of ancestors who crossed the Atlantic in chains. Yet for generations, the story of slavery was often silenced or distorted. In many countries, textbooks and public commemorations ignored the scale of the slave trade or minimized its brutality. Descendants of enslaved people faced ongoing discrimination, poverty, and exclusion, even as they built new lives and vibrant cultures. In recent decades, a movement for truth and recognition has grown. Artists, writers, and historians have brought the hidden stories of slavery to the forefront, demanding justice and reparations. Former slave forts in Africa, plantations in the Americas, and graveyards hidden beneath city streets have become sites of memory and reflection. The legacy of slavery is present in persistent inequalities, economic, social, and psychological, that affect millions today. but it is also visible in the resilience, creativity, and achievements of the African diaspora. Music, religion, food, and language carry echoes of Africa and the long struggle for freedom. To remember is to honor those who endured and to acknowledge the work that remains. Memory is not only about the past, but about the possibilities of healing, justice, and reconciliation in the future. The African diaspora, created through centuries of forced migration, is one of the most significant legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. Today, people of African descent live throughout the Americas, Europe, the Caribbean, and beyond, forming vibrant communities that shape global culture, politics, and society. Despite the trauma of slavery and the ongoing challenges of racism and inequality, the African diaspora has thrived. In cities from Rio de Janeiro to New York, London to Kingston, Black communities have developed unique expressions of art, music, literature, and spirituality. Genres like jazz, reggae, samba, blues, hip-hop, and gospel have transformed world music. Writers and thinkers from the diaspora have led movements for civil rights, independence, and social justice. Diaspora communities continue to grapple with questions of identity and belonging, reclaiming lost languages, reconnecting with African traditions, and forging new forms of solidarity. Family reunions, festivals, and international networks celebrate both the diversity and unity of people whose ancestors endured the Middle Passage. At the same time, the legacy of the slave trade is still felt in patterns of economic inequality and underrepresentation. Activists work to confront these issues, drawing inspiration from a long history of resistance and resilience. The struggle for justice, dignity, and recognition links the diaspora across continents and generations. The African diaspora stands as a testament to survival and creativity. Its ongoing contributions to world culture and its fight for justice honor the memory of those who endured the transatlantic slave trade and remind us that the story is far from over. Healing from the wounds of slavery is an ongoing process, both for individuals and for entire societies. Across the world, countries, communities, and descendants of enslaved people are seeking ways to acknowledge the past, confront injustice, and build bridges toward reconciliation. This work is difficult and often painful, but it is essential for true progress. ISTU, truth-telling, is a crucial first step. Governments, churches, and educational institutions are beginning to admit their roles in the slave trade, issuing public apologies and supporting research into their histories. Memorials and museums provide spaces for remembrance and reflection, while public ceremonies honor those who suffered and celebrate the resilience of their descendants. Many descendants of enslaved people are leading efforts to reclaim ancestral names, restore family ties, and reconnect with the cultures of Africa. Artists and activists create new symbols of unity and hope, using music, literature, and public art to spark conversation and inspire healing. Dialogue between communities, both within and across nations, helps break down barriers and fosters understanding. There are growing calls for reparations, concrete actions to address the economic and social inequalities that stem from slavery. This includes investment in education, healthcare, and opportunities for affected communities. While opinions about reparations differ, the conversation itself is a sign of progress. Healing and reconciliation are not about forgetting the past, but about honoring its lessons. They require courage, empathy, and a commitment to justice. Only by facing history honestly can societies move forward. forging a future in which the dignity and humanity of every person is recognized. As the journey through the story of the transatlantic slave trade draws to a close, one message rises above all. Never forget the suffering endured by millions, the families torn apart, and the cultures transformed by slavery must be remembered, not just as history, but as a living part of who we are today. Forgetting risks, repeating the mistakes of the past, remembering honors the resilience of those who survived, and the countless lives lost. It compels societies to confront hard truths about racism, inequality, and the unfinished work of justice. To remember is to stand with the ancestors, to hear their stories, and to pass them forward to future generations. Education is key. Teachers, parents, and community leaders play a vital role in sharing these stories with the young, fostering empathy and inspiring action. Memorials, museums, and commemorative events help keep memory alive, while literature, music, and art connect us emotionally to the struggles and triumphs of the past. The call to remember is also a call to act, to build a world where freedom, dignity, and equality are real for everyone. It is a call to stand against all forms of oppression and discrimination, wherever they exist. As long as we remember the courage, faith, and creativity of the enslaved and their descendants will continue to inspire hope and change. Let us honor their memory by forging bonds of understanding, compassion, and justice. In doing so, we help ensure that the horrors of the past are never repeated, and that the dream of true freedom finally becomes a reality for all. First, call for